So, I've been thinking of making this for a while now. I haven't really prepped myself. I've decided for this video I'll just wing it and explain my thoughts in just as open a manner as possible. Usually I try to prepare at least like a few paragraphs that I've typed up on Microsoft Word to explain specific points that I want to get across so that my points remain as concise as possible. But for this, I'm afraid it'll just be a bit more rambly. I feel that there is a very real failure of compassion and a failure of critical thinking happening not just across the public sphere, but within Western atheist YouTube personalities who speak on the issue of how to discuss atheism or religion with theists. There's this general argument that we should, as people who don't classify as believing in a God, that we need to be as friendly and congenial as possible, and that the lack of friendliness means that we are not showing a clear sense of compassion and openness towards theists. But I feel that this is a very narrow focus that ignores some very pressing concerns that have only worsened and broadened globally regarding specific religious beliefs. And obviously for this topic, we're focusing on Catholicism. I feel too often that within the context of Trump politics, or the Trump political world, we often preface our messages on YouTube or on Twitter or other social media platforms by first insisting that what we're going to say is controversial, and then saying that, we expect a bunch of triggered or angry people to come into the comment sections or the Twitter feeds and respond negatively to what was said. But I think that it really shows a very egotistical way of thinking to argue that you're going to talk on a controversial topic and that any angry message or negative response is just somehow people being conceited and failing to be open to your ideas. I mean, the irony of that is quite plain to me. It's poisoning the well and not really being open to criticism because you've already dismissed the criticism as invalid before you've even received it at all. And that kind of argument never made any sense to me. So I'm going to be talking about a very controversial topic. I expect to receive negative responses, and I am okay with that. And I hope that if I feel that I am sufficiently disproven in this argument, then maybe I can make a update video, saying I've changed my mind whenever I have the opportunity to do so. But I think there's a real dangerous lack of understanding of the scope and systemic abuse of the Catholic Church practically everyone who has read up on it knows that it has gone global, that it's on a global scale, and has a rough idea on the patterns of abuse. But I don't think that people allow what that means and to accept what a danger that poses to society, and especially to innocent children who are the majority of the victims. It is a really depressing, painful topic, but one that has become all the more pressing and which we shouldn't ignore on just moral grounds. Now, I've seen fellow atheists argue that we should be more friendly and less harsh in our words when criticizing religion, because I think the thinking goes that it'll hopefully change minds all the faster. But I think this is a severe lack of critical thinking regarding the systemic abuse of some of these religions, and a clear lack of compassion for their victims, and a solid understanding of just how horrid and dangerous some of these organizations can be. In this particular video, the Catholic Church, but they are not exempt. The Catholic Church is not the only Christian organization or only religious organization that has conducted abuses. And to be perfectly frank, I don't understand how my fellow atheists in the West can actually argue that we shouldn't deride certain religions as some sort of mental illness when we have clear patterns of abuse of children in just about every country that the Catholic Church has set foot in. Is that wrong to say? Should it be wrong to say? Who would be protected by speaking nicely to people? I find that the argument that we need to speak more nicely and have kinder tones really only serves to help abusers and ignores the significance of victims of abuse of power. Now, if you're a person who isn't Catholic, let me just pose a question to you. In the Catholic Church, children are being raped due to being taught fairy tales. Is that offensive to say? Possibly. Is it wrong to say? If it's wrong, why? Because when I pose that, in my mind, I am thinking that if this were any other organization, if this was a non-religious organization, the Catholic Church equivalent to what has happened would just be gone. If it was not a faith-based organization, it would be strewn in so much litigation and put a stop to as far as its operations. It would not be tolerated at all. But because it's a faith-based organization, we need this kindness, this sensitivity, this friendliness that isn't deserved. It's completely undeserved at this point. If this was any other organization, we would be reacting differently. We would not be speaking kindly or nicely to members of that organization. You could argue like, oh, not all so-and-so are bad. Some of them are very nice. You can't just label them all in a broad brush, so on and so forth. Okay. But if this were a political organization, or really, if this was any other type of organization, it would file for bankruptcy almost immediately. We wouldn't have to worry about being nice. Now, you might make a special case for religion, but why? Because it's a faith-based group, and faith is so important to the identity. It's somehow inappropriate to just point out the horrible activities of this organization to its followers, as if doing so is not treating these issues seriously, when in fact it is the complete opposite. We should be pointing these problems out harshly and in as direct a manner as possible, because we have compassion, because we are taking these horrible events seriously. But I've seen too often that religious groups and even atheists try to argue that pointing out child rape cases is somehow being insincere. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever in terms of logic and in terms of compassion for the victims. In either way you look at it, I look at it in both, it makes no sense to ardently argue that pointing out truth is a failure of compassion and a failure of human reasoning. This is really the most clear-cut and blatant example you can find of a religious organization that is a child pedophile ring. And I think it has not adequately sunk in that these abuses are systemic. And what that means. There's this weird argument that, oh, it's only a few people here, a few people there, and that the entirety of the church is generally good, and that the higher-ups are either incompetent or abusing power and or corrupt. And I find that these standard arguments that you could find for any corporation that is mistreating its employees due to actions of wage theft or whatnot are insincere and are not fully grasping the issue of children being raped by people who society expects to be caregivers and concerned about their well-being. Now, for a believer of Catholicism or a theist, it's due to either a lack of believing in the right God or lack of adequate concern for abuses of power. But when an atheist seems to be arguing in defense of treating these issues with civility, or that the church can reform, they're arguing from a perspective in which they know They know that children are being raped because of fairy tales. And honestly, why, as an atheist, would you expect priests who believe more strongly in fantastical things to be more moral? Why would you? They believe more in the nonsensical fairy tales than the average person in the public. Why expect good moral behavior from people who are more strongly devoted than people who are just semi-devoted and who don't base their entire life around devotion to fantasy, to a complete fantasy world after death? Now, you might think that's offensive, that I'm belittling people, that I'm trivializing, but from my perspective, you are all defending an organization that is raping children because of fairy tales. And I think as atheists, if there are atheists listening to this, you should really seriously consider that the teachings of this denomination of Christianity, or Christianity itself, are the cause of these child rapes. Whenever I say that, it's deemed offensive, even when I bring up real beliefs within the Catholic Church, such as the different views between cardinal sins and mortal sins, or the seal of confession. But for this video, I just want to focus on the scope and scale of this issue, because I feel that people have not adequately understood or been willing to accept the full systemic failings of the Catholic Church and the decades of abuse that have been happening because of their actions, regardless of which pope was in power, regardless of what country the Catholic Church is operating in, and regardless of the number of victims that piled up because of the Catholic Church's actions. Some atheist YouTubers have argued that we shouldn't treat certain religions like mental illnesses, but what do you call global child rape abuses that are protected by a global religious organization? It's clear that the Catholic Church's behavior and teachings lead to certain pathologies. And as offensive as this is to say, I think we as a civilization should seriously consider this. The spread of Catholicism means the spread of child rapes across the world. Should that be offensive to say, despite the overwhelming evidence? And I do mean overwhelming evidence for decades now. Some of them, like the Native American boarding schools, stretching back nearly 100 years of abuse of children, including rape, starvation, beatings, and in 2 different countries. So for this video, I'd like to read some snippets of various articles, which I will link in the description as sources, so that viewers can fully understand the scope and scale of this horrifying problem. Then focus our attention on the response of the Catholic Church in recent years, not just 10 years back, but recently. And then I'll give my own final views on the topic. In a June 2019 article on The Independent, it explains that Birmingham's Catholic Church protected pedophile priests and allowed child sex abuse to continue in order to preserve its own reputation. A damning inquiry found. The Archdiocese of Birmingham repeatedly failed to alert police to allegations against its clergy, and in doing so let perpetrators carry on abusing victims for years, the report concluded. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse examined more than 130 allegations of abuse against 78 people associated with the Archdiocese since the 1930s. But it said that the true scale of offending was likely to be far higher. 13 abusers have been convicted, and 3 other individuals received cautions over offenses involving 53 children. Many other victims have since died, meaning their allegations cannot be fully investigated. Further down the article, it explains that senior figures at the Archdiocese were first informed of allegations against Robinson, one of the abusers, in 1972, some 30 years before police launched the criminal investigation that led to his arrest. Over the following decades, the church was warned repeatedly about the priest, who was finally convicted of 21 offenses against the 4 victims in 2010 and jailed for 21 years. Instead of reporting the allegations to the police or investigating internally, the Archdiocese moved Robinson to another parish and in 1985 helped him to flee to the United States, where he received financial assistance from the church for 7 years. The inquiry panel said Cardinal Nichols had compounded victims' pain by issuing a press release following the BBC documentary, which focused too much on his grievances with the program makers and too little on the public interest in exposing the abuse committed by the clergy and the harm done to victims of such abuse. The panel, which held 6 days of hearings into the Birmingham Archdiocese handling of abuse claims, also considered the cases of 3 other priests. The report found little or no steps were taken to protect children from the risk of abuse by the late John Tolkien, son of novelist J.R.R. Tolkien, despite the church knowing he posed a danger. The Archdiocese settled a civil claim out of court with an alleged victim of the priest who died in 2003 and never faced prosecution because of his failing health. In an article on AP News on September 2018, an excerpt reads, "On Tuesday, the German Bishops' Conference released a report which found that some 3,677 people, more than half of them 13 or younger, and nearly a third of them altar boys, were abused by clergy between 1946 and 2014. The report, compiled by university researchers, found evidence that some files were manipulated or destroyed, many cases were not brought to justice, and that sometimes abusers were simply moved to other dioceses without congregations being informed about their past. The abuse scandal, which erupted in Ireland in the 1990s and subsequently in Australia and the US, now threatens Francis's own papacy, since his record as cardinal and pope has proven uneven. A former Vatican ambassador has also accused Francis of rehabilitating an American cardinal who slept with seminarians. In a February 2017 article on PBS, excerpt reads, 7% of priests in the Australian Catholic Church have been accused of sexually abusing children between 1950 and 2010, according to a report released Monday. The report from Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, which since 2013 has been investigating how the Catholic Church and others have responded to abuse, says 4,444 people had reported being sexually abused at more than 1,000 Catholic institutions across Australia between 1980 and 2015. Victims' ages averaged 10.5 years old for girls and 11.5 years old for boys. Most survivors were male. The study said schools and homes for children were the places children were most likely to experience abuse. The accounts were depressingly similar, authors of the report wrote. Children were ignored or worse, punished. Allegations were not investigated. Priests and religious were moved. The parishes or communities to which they were moved knew nothing of their past. Documents were not kept, or they were destroyed. Secrecy prevailed, as did cover-ups. Priests and religious were not properly dealt with, and outcomes were often not representative of their crimes. Many children suffered and continue as adults to suffer from their experiences in some Catholic institutions. Of the 1,880 alleged perpetrators identified in the report, 32% were religious brothers, 30% were priests, 29% were lay people, and 5% were religious sisters. Francis Sullivan, CEO of the Truth, Justice, and Healing Council, which coordinates with the Catholic Church's response to the inquiry, called the situation a massive failure on the part of the Catholic Church in Australia to protect children from abusers. These numbers are shocking, they are tragic, and they are indefensible, Sullivan said at a public hearing Monday. As Catholics, we hang our heads in shame. Of the 309 cases the Commission made to the Australian police, 27 have been prosecuted and another 75 are under investigation. The other cases are either pending or the people involved have died, the report says. In a February 2018 article on Reuters, an excerpt reads, Providence is home to El Bosque, the former parish of priest Fernando Caradima, I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, who was found guilty in a Vatican investigation in 2011 of abusing teenage boys over many years, spurring a chain of events leading to this week's visit by a Vatican investigator. A Chilean judge in the same year determined the Vatican's canonical sentence was valid, but Caradima was not prosecuted by the civil justice system because the statute of limitations had expired. So many Chileans were shocked in 2015 when Pope Francis appointed a bishop, a clergyman accused of covering up for Caradima, and defended that choice in a visit to Chile last month. In a June 2018 article on U.S. News regarding the scandals in Chile, an excerpt reads, Luis Badilla, a Chilean Vatican watcher who is based in Rome, says several of the conservative bishops who rose to power in Chile were Caradima's friends. In other countries, we've seen similar sex abuse cases, but they were isolated to one bishop or one priest, he says. In Chile, we're dealing with the policy of a whole episcopate, where those who were not guilty didn't have the strength or the courage to stand against what was going on. The Pope did not help matters in his January visit to Chile when Francis spoke in defense of a bishop here who Catholics say protected Caradima. The Pope's comments about the bishop Juan Barros, Madrid, drew heavy criticism and that raised questions about the pontiff's commitment to healing. "We've reached a breaking point," says Hamilton, the abuse victim who visited the Pope. "The question is whether Pope Francis' austere evangelical spirit will prevail over a cast of personalities who behave as powerful princes." An interesting way of saying that. Moving on. In the Great Falls Tribunal, the article about Montana's reservations being dumping grounds for pedophile priests, published in August 2017, begins with, "For decades, even lifetimes, the Catholic Church refused to turn in priests with known pasts of sexually abusing children, women, and men. The story is known in as many corners of the world as the Catholic Church exists, including Montana's 2 dioceses." Further on it reads, "In the Pacific Northwest, however, the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order have been accused of using Indian reservations as their dumping grounds for the worst recidivist priests accused of sexually abusing children throughout the 1900s. Here, church officials reportedly determined predatory priests could remain undetected. Here, the church acted as an anchor for the communities, and the victims lived with the abuse in silence." Attorney Vito de la Cruz said Montana reservations were no different. They were the church's rural and remote sites for hiding predatory priests. Cruz's Seattle law firm has represented victims from Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Idaho, and Montana. And he said the systematic issue is told from church documents revealed in cases already settled, and the active one against the Great Falls Billings Diocese. Further in the article it reads, "The Great Falls Billings Diocese lawsuit currently includes 72 victims of sexual abuse by clergy members. Of those who provide locations and dates of the alleged abuse, 40 said it happened to them on a reservation, and 21 of those say they were abused at the St. Paul Mission in Hayes. Of the 21 alleged victims from St. Paul, 8 men and women who have come forward said they were molested by Robinson, one of the Catholic priests, and oftentimes several other church officials in the same time frame. Robinson is accused of molesting 9 children across the state during his career. There could be more, as there may be other victims of any clergy who chose not to come forward. Others accused of repeated abuse at St. Paul include Father Fred Simoneau, whose 5 victims claim abuse from 1955 to 1974, Brother Ryan, whose alleged abuse spans from 1955 to 1966, and Brother Clarence Moria, who is accused of sexually molesting 4 children from 1959 to 1971. Only one person has come forward to claim abuse in Wolf Point on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation further northeast, but in southeastern Montana, 11 people have claimed that they were sexually abused at the St. Labor Indian Mission on the northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation, while 7 have made similar allegations from the St. Xavier Indian Mission on the Crow Indian Reservation. Father Emmett Hoffman is accused of molesting students at the St. Labor Indian School in Ashland, but his relationship with the reservation was different than Robinson's. Further on in the article is a quote from the son of an abuse victim. From what I know, they came to help us from ourselves, Azure said. I think it was another attempt to, in the Church's view, civilize a race that they viewed as uncivilized. They opened churches, gained membership, and eventually sent children to be assimilated at boarding schools, where physical and sexual abuse was reported. At a boarding school in South Dakota, Azure's own father said he was sexually abused by priests who would give children medicine that made them drowsy. Once subdued by the mixture, whether it was cough syrup or whiskey, Azure never knew. Priests allegedly brought them to a basement room and sexually abused children like Azure's father. On The Guardian, from an article a year ago, on September 2018, an excerpt from the beginning reads, more than half of the Netherlands' senior clerics were involved in covering up sexual assault of children between 1945 and 2010, a press report claimed on Saturday, further engulfing the Catholic Church in a global abuse scandal. Over the course of 65 years, 20 of 39 Dutch cardinals, bishops, and their auxiliaries covered up sexual abuse, allowing the perpetrators to cause many more victims, the Daily NRC reported. 4 abused children and 16 others allowed the transfer of pedophile priests who could have caused new victims in other parishes, the Dutch newspaper added. Church spokeswoman Daphne van Roosendale said the church could confirm a part of the report. Other elements were based on anonymous information provided by a victims assistance unit set up by the church. The names of several bishops correspond to those named in a report commissioned by the church in 2010, von Roosdale said. Most of the accused clerics have since died, and the statute of limitations has expired in all cases, she added. Those still alive declined to comment, NRC said. Meanwhile, in France, a priest has been charged with sexually abusing 4 siblings, now aged 13 to 17, his lawyer said. The family brought the complaint against the 64-year-old priest, whose parish is in the central Cantal region. All 4 siblings were said to be in the church choir. The lawyer, Romain Bocoum, did not say when the alleged offenses were said to have taken place. Local bishop Bruno Grua said his diocese was shocked by these unspeakable acts. They are the latest in a slew of assault allegations against the Catholic Church, spanning several continents. Notice that assault allegations, sex abuse, child abuse, but not specifically what these crimes are. Crimes of child rape. That people are not necessarily whitewashing, but trying to find more comforting labels to ignore the sheer horror of what this organization does, what it continues to defend and protect, what it has failed to stop. What is the point of being nice when an organization goes this far? What is the point of being nice even to its followers, regardless of how large they are? When an organization goes this far, and these people are still too blind to accept the horror of what this organization has wrought. A supplementary article on CNN that was published in December 2011, many years prior, helps put this Dutch scandal in more context. It reads, thousands and thousands of children suffered from sexual abuse in the Dutch Roman Catholic Church over more than 6 decades, and about 800 possible perpetrators have been identified, an independent commission of inquiry said Friday. Several tens of thousands of minors have experienced mild, serious, and very serious forms of inappropriate sexual behavior. Victims have often suffered from decades from the effects of abuse and have received acknowledgement of the fact, the panel says in its report. This has caused problems for them, their immediate family, and their friends, who require attention and sometimes professional counseling. The report, which covers a period from 1945 to 2010, says the scale of the abuse is relatively small in percentage terms, but is a serious problem in absolute numbers. The victims were under the responsibility of the range of people working in the church: priests, brothers, pastoral workers, and lay persons, it says. An article by the New Republic on the Pennsylvania grand jury report, the infamous one, reads in an excerpt, the 900-page report, which investigated all but one of the state's dioceses, identifies over 1,000 victims of child sexual abuse and over 300 predatory priests. The report explains why abuse flourished for so long. While each church district had its idiosyncrasies, the pattern was pretty much the same. The main thing was not to help children, but to avoid scandal. That is not our word, but theirs. It appears over and over again in the documents we recovered, the report asserts. Church officials kept complaints in a secret archive, to which only the bishop kept the key. The report also states the diocesan files repeatedly relied on euphemism to describe clergy abuse. The files refer to rape as inappropriate contact, for example. Predatory priests were referred to treatment, and in the rare instance the church removed a priest from his parish, his congregants never learned the real reason for his departure. The Catholic Church already reels from abuse scandals, some old and some more recent. The patterns documented by the Pennsylvania grand jury resemble previous abuse scandals, the most famous example being the Archdiocese of Boston's cover of decades of child abuse. In July, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick resigned over revelations that he abused seminarians and at least one minor. On Tuesday, Crux, a Catholic news website, reported that Boston's Cardinal Shane O'Malley had been informed of McCarrick's abuse back in 2015. And on Tuesday, several hours before the Pennsylvania grand jury published its report, Chilean police raided the country's bishops' conference in connection to an ongoing child abuse investigation involving the congregation of the Marist brothers. Continuing on, and to give better context, a report 10 years ago, on May 2009, on The Guardian, there was an endemic degree of rape and abuse of Irish children in Catholic care, according to a investigation that took place for a period of 9 years. This article is from May 2009 and explains from the excerpt that I've highlighted as follows. Rape and sexual molestation were endemic in Irish Catholic church-run industrial schools and orphanages, a report revealed today. The 9-year investigation found that Catholic priests and nuns for decades terrorized thousands of boys and girls in the Irish Republic, while government inspectors failed to stop the chronic beatings, rape, and humiliation. The High Court judge, Shane Ryan, today unveiled the 2,600-page final report of Ireland's Commission into Child Abuse, which drew on testimony from thousands of former inmates and officials from more than 250 church-run institutions. Police were called to the news conference amid angry scenes as victims were prevented from attending. More than 30,000 children deemed to be petty thieves, truants, or from dysfunctional families, a category that often included unmarried mothers, were sent to Ireland's austere network of industrial schools, reformatories, orphanages, and hostels from the 1930s until the last facilities shut in the 1990s. The findings prompted the new Archbishop of Westminster, the Most Rev. Vincent Nichols, to say that it took courage for those clergy involved in the child sex abuse to confront their actions. In an interview to be broadcast tonight on ITV News at 10, he said, "I think of those in religious orders and some of the clergy in Dublin who have to face these facts from their past, which instinctively and quite naturally they'd rather not look at. That takes courage. And also, we shouldn't forget that this account today will also overshadow all of the good that they also did." The sheer degree of narcissism in that statement. Wow. Continuing on. The Irish Survivors of Child Abuse, ISOCA, an organization set up to help victims, condemned the newly appointed head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales for his remarks. Rubbish is too kind of word for what the Archbishop has said. I believe I have heard this kind of twaddle uttered by politicians in Ireland, like Bertie Ahern, the former Prime Minister. It is the verbiage of unreason, and it leaves me cold. What the Archbishop really has to do is take a long, hard look at the character and nature of the people he is talking about and ask himself if they are capable of being good, said Patrick Walsh. The report found that molestation and rape were endemic in boys' facilities, chiefly run by the Christian Brothers Order, and supervisors pursued policies that increased the danger. Girls supervised by orders of nuns, chiefly the Sisters of Mercy, suffered much less sexual abuse, but instead endured frequent assaults and humiliation, designed to make them feel worthless. In some schools, a high level of ritualized beating was routine. Girls were struck with implements designed to maximize pain and were struck on all parts of the body, the report said. Personal and family denigration was widespread. The report concluded that when confronted with evidence of sex abuse, religious authorities responded by transferring offenders to another location, where in many instances they were free to abuse again. There was evidence that such men took up teaching positions, sometimes within days of receiving dispensations, because of serious allegations or admissions of sexual abuse, the report said. The safety of children in general was not a consideration. The Catholic Church had been steeling itself for the report, which was repeatedly delayed by church lawsuits, missing documentation, and alleged government obstruction. The Christian Brothers delayed the investigation for more than a year, with a lawsuit that successfully defended their members' rights to anonymity. In all references in the report, even in cases in which individual Christian brothers had been convicted of sexual and physical attacks on children. The church had already been under fire over the sexual misbehavior of several priests in various Irish parishes. The Commission's experts have sought to produce a comprehensive portrait of sexual, physical, and emotional damage inflicted on the child victims. The thousands of survivors said they had no safe way to tell their stories until the investigation began, because much of the Irish Catholic society regarded them as liars. This next article from August 2018 explains how two of the leading Catholic schools had a culture of acceptance of sexual abuse of children. Regular schools are not places designed for rehabilitation or related to orphanages. The excerpt highlighted reads, "The true scale of sexual abuse at two of the UK's leading Catholic independent schools over a period of 40 years is likely to have been far greater than has been proved in the courts," a report by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse has concluded. 10 people have been convicted or cautioned in relation to sexual offences at Ampleforth in North Yorkshire and Downside in Somerset. The schools prioritized the monks and their reputations over the protection of children in order to avoid scandal, says the 211-page report published by ICSA on Thursday after hearings last year. The monks avoided giving information to or cooperating with statutory authorities investigating abuse, it says. Their approach could be summarized as a tell-them-nothing attitude. The report says appalling sexual abuse was inflicted over decades on children as young as 7 at Ampleforth School and 11 at Downside School. The inquiry heard that boys were made to strip naked and were beaten. Some were allegedly forced to give and receive oral sex, both privately and in front of other pupils. Alleged abuse included digital penetration of the anus and children being compelled to perform sexual acts on each other. Physical abuse had sadistic and sexual overtones, the report says. One survivor described his abuser at Ampleforth as an out-and-out sadist. A victim of Piers Grant Ferris, who was convicted in 2006 of assaulting 15 boys, described being forced to straddle a bath naked as the monk beat him while masturbating. It was absolutely terrifying, he told the inquiry. Many perpetrators did not hide their sexual interests from the children. The blatant openness of these activities demonstrates there was a culture of acceptance of abusive behavior, the report says. 10 people, mostly monks, connected to the two schools have been convicted or cautioned in relation to offenses involving sexual activity with a large number of children or pornography. Ampleforth and Downside are schools attached to abbeys of the English Benedictine congregation and are regarded as leading Catholic independent schools. Monks at both institutions were very often secretive, evasive, and suspicious of anyone outside the English Benedictine congregation, the report says. In 2001, the Nolan Report made recommendations on the safeguarding of children in the Catholic Church, including that incidents or allegations of sexual abuse should be referred to the statutory authorities. Both schools seem to take a view that the report's implementation was neither obligatory nor desirable. This failure to comply appeared to go unchallenged by the Catholic Church. The ICSA report says, at Ampleforth and Downside, a number of allegations were never referred to the police, but were handled internally. It says an abbot of Ampleforth between 1997 and 2005, Timothy Wright, clung to outdated beliefs about pedophilia and had an immovable attitude of always knowing best. Abbots at both schools would confine suspected perpetrators to the abbey or transfer them elsewhere. Records were destroyed by both schools. The report says one former headmaster of Downside made several trips with a wheelbarrow with files to the edge of the estate and made a bonfire of them. During the inquiry's hearings, senior clergymen in the English Benedictine congregation expressed regret for past failures to protect children. However, this was not accompanied by a full acknowledgement of the tolerance of serious criminal activity or the recognition that previous misjudgment had devastating consequences for the lives of young people involved. The report recommends a strict separation between the governance of the two abbeys and the schools. It acknowledges that some steps have been taken, but says neither school has formally established a comprehensive redress system and no public apology has been made. Next up, a February 1st, 2019 article by NBC News. Hundreds of accused abusers named by Catholic leaders in Texas. Catholic leaders in Texas on Thursday identified 286 priests and others accused of sexually abusing children, a number that represents one of the largest collections of names to be released since a explosive grand jury report last year in Pennsylvania. 14 dioceses in Texas named those credibly accused of abuse. The only diocese not to provide names, Fort Worth, did so more than a decade ago, and then provided an updated accounting in October. There are only a handful of states where every diocese has released names, and most of them have only 1 or 2 Catholic districts. Arkansas, for instance, is covered by the Diocese of Little Rock, which in September provided a preliminary list of 12 former priests, deacons, and others. Oklahoma has 2 districts. The Archdiocese of Oklahoma City is scheduled to publicly identify accused priests on February 28th, and the Diocese of Tulsa previously named 2 former priests accused of predatory behavior. The move by Texas church leaders follows a shocking Pennsylvania report in August detailing 7 decades of child sexual abuse by more than 300 predator priests. Furthermore, the Illinois Attorney General reported last month that at least 500 Catholic clergy in that state had sexually abused children. In the months after that report, about 50 dioceses and religious provinces have released the names of nearly 1,250 priests and others accused of abuse. Approximately 60% of them have died. About 30 other dioceses are investigating or have promised to release names of credibly accused priests in the coming months. In Texas, the Diocese of Dallas and some others relied on retired police and federal investigators to review church files and other material to substantiate claims of abuse. It's not clear whether any of the names released Thursday could result in local prosecutors bringing criminal charges. It's not clear whether any of the names released Thursday could result in local prosecutors bringing criminal charges. The majority of those identified have since died. Some investigations dated back to 1950, while other reviews, as in the case of the Diocese of Laredo, only went to 2000 because that's when that diocese was established. Of the 286 men named in Texas, 172 have died, a percentage comparable with the national tally. Now, to pause for a bit, I understand that a lot of these locations, numbers, and the specific archdiocese can get so confusing. And it's due to the volume of these cases of child rape by the Catholic Church and the people working under them. Catholic priests and other Catholic workers have abuse crimes so numerous, so widespread. Like, the absolute worst ideas that you could think of regarding an organization having a pedophile ring is precisely how the Catholic Church operates and has operated for decades. You can say that's offensive, you can say it hurts feelings, or that it's too extreme, or perhaps juvenile, I think, is the most used term. But that kind of blowback ignores the fact that children are being raped because of this organization. It ignores the rape victims, the numerous amount of rape victims, as somehow just normal processes, like the weather. Is this really the standard that any society should accept to live in? Is this really a standard that we should simply accept is just a part of life within our communities, with people that we know? Just because we want to maintain a friendly attitude? The amount of child rape by this organization is so monumentous that none of us can really wrap our heads around it. There are so many child rape reports on just different facilities, usually just one or two, that stretch back decades, really decades, with patterns of abuse. And why then should it be offensive to say it's an overglorified child rape ring because of religion? If this was a corporation, a union, or an NGO, or a school, it would be shut down with this level of abuse. But we give this special privilege, even among atheists, we give this special privilege of trying to have some form of civility with religion, even when there is overwhelming evidence that it doesn't deserve to be treated with such respect. You can talk about hating Catholics as people, or hating Catholicism as an institution and how it's corrupt and so forth, but that Catholic people are great and awesome. But really, they've been brainwashed by an organization who they've trusted. And this organization has abused so many children all over the globe for decades. This idea of reforming the institution, is a waste of time. It is a waste of time because The only reason it exists is because it is a faith-based organization. And a faith-based organization is just fairy tales. Children are being sent to schools, churches, and so forth under the basis that they have superior morals. They'll turn them into good, upstanding citizens and be closer to the truth of God. But it is really just brainwashing them and allowing child rape rings to continue. Perhaps that seems extreme, but honestly, look at all the suffering that has been caused by this organization. And there is still more that can be covered. This is all just the tip of the iceberg. What is the point of defending it? What's the purpose? Besides defending an organization that teaches adults to believe more extremely in fairy tales and teaches children to also believe in these fairy tales with the expectation that belief in these fairy tales as part of reality somehow makes you a more morally good person or a morally well-adjusted person. The demonization of sexual behavior and repression against it has resulted in some of the most shocking behavior, with children being the victims. And at the moment, there seems to be calls for allowing priests to marry. Why would allowing priests to marry solve anything? If you look at ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups, they can marry. It didn't stop any pedophilia. So, what is the point? We do have an organization that we can compare it to, a religious organization that does allow marriage within the ranks. And if that's not good enough, another Christian organization, since this is a Jewish organization, so some may argue that there are different tenets or so forth. But another Christian organization, the Coptic Christians, have also had abuses of pedophilia back in, I believe it was 2009, in Egypt. So, allowing priests to marry won't mean anything. It won't change this behavior. And I think, quite honestly, this ignores one of the problems that could be the reason, but which people would be against talking about. To what extent do the teachings in Catholicism cause this sort of behavior? To what extent is the tenets of Catholicism pathological to the development of people, and to what degree could it cause pedophilia and other abuses against children? Should that cause offense to anyone? Is that wrong to say, given the absolutely overwhelming amount of evidence of these abuses? I'm noticing that people, far too often than not, try to say, it's about power, it's about people not doing what they're supposed to do, and it's about hurting the innocent because because it's human beings who are sinful with all this power. But that seems like a way of trying to generalize what is going on in the most simplistic manner possible and not going into particular specifics and the details of what has been going on. And there are people who argue that the amount of child abuse is indicative that it's not a Christian organization but a satanic organization. Well, you should think about the idea that these Christian beliefs have an unintended consequence of committing these horrible abuses. This hatred against the physical body, hatred against sexual pleasure, this disturbing amount of focus on innocence as a moral good, the deep sense of misogyny within a lot of these Christian organizations, especially the conservative ones. These can all be factors. You also have entire conservative societies, like in the Middle East, that repress women's ability for sexual liberty, that have sexual slavery as a social norm, as reported in many media outlets. So this is not something that is unique to the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church has this issue on a more global and worse scale than most other religious organizations, with the exception of Islam, arguably. Because if you look at Islam within the context of Islamic countries with a horrible level of treatment against women, then comparatively they would be larger in proportion. But this does not discount or downplay the level of abuse against children, against Catholic children. Not that it should matter what sort of child it is, but regardless, against the horrible level of abuse against children globally by the Catholic Church. So this should seriously prompt people to question whether the spreading of Catholicism would cause more of this epidemic of child rape by this organization. Why wouldn't it, logically speaking? Especially in third world countries where they would have a better ability to destroy any information that they have which could cause a scandal, and where they would have greater control using their money and profits from donations to influence the local governments to shut down any investigation, or perhaps have a greater chance to win lawsuits. There would also be more maneuverability to shut down any investigation of, or tamper with, or destroy evidence of child rape in third world countries. But it's already pretty bad in Western countries, where, while it may seem admirable that many Catholic leaders are now sharing information about child molesters, rapists, and so forth in their ranks, please take note of the fact that many, in fact the majority of the people being revealed were after the statute of limitations had expired, and usually long after these people had died. That way they could not be sued. They made sure that their bottom line and their reputation wouldn't take a hit. And this way they can present themselves as, oh yes, we're reforming, we're changing our ways, but in reality, they're making sure that they are not financially hurt, so that they can still present themselves as being moral and upstanding, even though as an organization they've been hiding, moving, and ignoring reforms regarding the child rapists in their ranks. And then they wait until the statute of limitations are done before they reveal the pedophiles to the public. Because please note, a lot of the pedophiles, such as even in the Pennsylvania grand jury report, could not be named in the court cases, even though the church could move them to other locations. The court had decided that these predators within the Catholic Church couldn't have their names revealed to the public. But after the statute of limitations is done, and usually after they die, then the Catholic Church tries to present themselves as heroes, revealing the truth and being humble and holy. Now, that might seem obvious to people outside the religious organization, but for atheists who come from Catholic backgrounds or who have very positive views of Christianity still, they don't seem to think on this. They don't seem to realize the level of self-interest in the Catholic Church's behavior. The Catholic Church is quite obviously only out for what the Catholic Church needs. And even if that were not the case, even if they were being humble in their reforms, this still would not justify the child rape going on because of fairy tales. So, moving on to the next part. West Virginia sues Catholic Church for covering up sex abuse. Nice little euphemism for covering up child rape. This is an ongoing lawsuit. Full details have not been revealed yet. At least not in this article. I'm unaware if this has been updated since March of this year. I'd like for you all to consider the sheer magnitude of what I've already shown you as far as the articles, and understand that this really is just the tip of the iceberg. There are probably many more victims who never tried to seek justice for what was done to them, either due to fear or shame or whatnot. Now, just imagine that. And imagine it multiplied in every country, in basically each state of every country. And yet people still try to redeem the Catholic Church, try to make excuses and justifications, and argue that anyone who criticizes the Catholic Church does so out of hatred. And I've personally experienced this sort of blowback. Like, anytime you criticize the Catholic Church for literally raping children, you're the one with hatred. What is that? I've noticed that people try to defend this I've noticed that people try to argue that it is because of power and corruption that events like this happen, and that power just goes to a priest's head. But in all honesty, even if you're a corrupt person with power, why would that necessarily mean you seek to rape children? I don't see how they get from A to B with that kind of... I don't even think it's a logical transition, honestly. I noticed that people try to make, even within news articles, try to make these crimes in the most general language. Like, you can tell from just the title of this U.S. News article. West Virginia sues Catholic Church for covering up sex abuse. It should be child rape. They abused children. They're usually always abusing innocent children, usually under the age of 16. And yet people still try to argue that it needs to be redeemed, it needs to find itself again, it needs to throw out all the bad eggs. But people really should consider that this is not a bug of religious ethics taught by the Catholic Church, but a natural, consequential feature as a result of those teachings. The Catholic Church demonizes consensual sex. They are essentially an institution that functions to venerate thought crimes, because you can't speak ill or disavow Jesus Christ, but mortal sins like rape, murder, and theft are forgivable. I think people genuinely need to consider that a priest is not more ethical because of the fact that they believe more strongly in Christian beliefs, but rather that they have less of a grasp on reality than the average person because of their convictions to their religious beliefs. This is actually an argument that Friedrich Nietzsche made in why he distrusted church institutions, because what they're really doing is believing in absolute nonsense, fairy tales, more strongly, and believe that these fairy tales are more real and more valuable than reality itself. To Friedrich Nietzsche, it was an organization that created an institution based on delusions and teaching and preaching to others this perpetual delusion. And considering the horrendous consequences and the length of time that these horrible rape crimes against children have occurred, it seems that this argument by Friedrich Nietzsche was on point, more on point than people who vilified him in the 1800s and early 1900s wanted to admit. This is in West Virginia. This is yet another lawsuit that'll have probably, who knows how many, honestly, who knows how many children revealed to be raped by Catholic priests who parents entrusted with the care of their children. Must any more need be said? Moving along. A scandal most people probably haven't thought of deeply. Nuns sexually abusing minors could become next Catholic Church scandal, experts say. This was in April 9th, 2019. An excerpt reads, "Last month, a Minnesota-based law firm that represents survivors of clerical abuse unveiled a long list of those who have been credibly accused of child molestation. The 185-page Anderson Report on Child Sexual Abuse in the Archdiocese and Diocese, which focused on Illinois and mostly on priests, also named 6 nuns among the 390 alleged abusers. Of the 6 nuns named, 3 are reported to now be dead. The whereabouts of the remaining 3 is not clear, the report stated. Some of the appalling claims date back half a century, but it's an issue that investigators believe is very much prevalent today and shrouded in the secrecy of survivors. Patrick J. Wall, a former Roman Catholic priest and Benedictine monk, who is now an expert in canon law and clergy sexual exploitation, rallying on behalf of other survivors at the Anderson firm, said that almost all cases involving nuns as perpetrators have been wiped from the vaults. The cases I remember, the nun was moved or a couple of times sent off for treatment. He said, "There is no public record, just quietly settled. Most states have no record of the cases being settled." Wall said that such cases he came across during his tenure in the church were all quietly settled, and that many accusations since have had statute of limitations problems. He also said there is next to no data specifically looking at the issue of sexual abuse by nuns, and there may not be any officially compiled anytime soon. The church has such a gigantic problem with the priests now, Wall conjectured. They likely are not concerned about the nuns. And Mary Dispenza, a director of the St. Louis-based Survivors Network of those abused by priests, SNAP, a support group for anyone harmed by institutional and religious authorities, told Fox News that it wasn't until recently, the age of 78, she too acknowledged that she was a victim of nun sexual abuse throughout her 15-year tenure. "It was an awakening for me, a story I carried around for so long, one of such confusion," said the former Southern California-based nun turned survivor advocate. Since federal authorities opened a probe into allegations of abuse at several dioceses in Pennsylvania last October, Dispenza noted that 67 individuals from across the United States have reached out to her with their own horror stories of misconduct. 56 of them documented sexual abuse by nuns. 4 claimed physical and emotional abuse. 2 were concerned nuns themselves, seeking information on how to improve their orders, and the remaining endured priest abuse. This number could be multiplied several times over, a few thousand around the world, she cautioned. It is another significant problem the church is yet to face. While the majority of those who reached out to Dispenza for guidance were female, she said some were male, recounting their childhood horrors. The men carry a great deal of shame, which has kept them from coming forward or speaking out, she observed. Just let that sink in. And think over how many other statute of limitations, how many other people not coming forward, how many other hundreds, if not thousands, across the world suffer because of an institution that preaches about fairy tales and seeks global dominance in conversions. This global dominance in conversions is only going to lead to more child rape at this pace. And judging from all the information, which is really just, again, the tip of the iceberg, that has been observed about this horrible institution, I cannot hold back my contempt because of how passive people are to the sheer breadth of human rights abuses that this institution is allowed to conduct willfully, all because they have a strong faith in make-believe. Real people suffering because of delusions, psychotic delusions. That everyone approves of. Is that offensive to say? Is that juvenile to say? Are we just going to focus on how horrible my words are and not the victims who are suffering because of this delusional institution? What is the point of reforming an institution like this? Honestly, what is the point of seeking redemption for an institution that conducts such horrible atrocities? Next up, seeing one of the consequences of spreading the religious faith of Catholicism to foreign countries. Indian bishop charged with repeatedly raping nun. From the Globe and Mail in an April 2019 article. Indian authorities charged a Roman Catholic bishop on Tuesday with repeatedly raping a nun in her rural convent, a case that helped make the sexual abuse of nuns a major issue in the church. Bishop Franco Mulakal was charged with rape, illegal confinement, and intimidation, said Hari Sankar, a district police chief in the southern state of Kerala, India's Catholic heartland. The nun who made the accusations, who has not been publicly identified, said she went to police last year only after complaining repeatedly to church authorities. Eventually, a group of fellow nuns launched an unprecedented public protest to demand Mulakal's arrest. He was arrested but released after a few weeks. Mulakal was the official patron of the nuns community, the Missionaries of Jesus, and wielded immense influence over its budgets and job assignments. The nun said the rapes occurred between 2014 and 2016. Next up, from a Guardian article regarding the same case, Indian Catholic nun protests against bishop accused of rape, which was published on September 2018. Former nuns have previously raised allegations of sexual exploitation by priests and other male clergy in the state, as prompting unprecedented publicity and calls for investigation. 5 nuns joined street protests at the weekend organized by Catholic reform groups, claiming the police were dragging their heels in the case. Church has not given us justice, one of the nuns, Sister Anupama MJ, told the Times of India. Neither have police or the government. We will fight. It was the church that forced us onto the streets. Outrage at the case grew on Sunday when a state politician, P.C. George, asked at a press conference why the nun had taken more than 2 years to raise the complaint. Quote, "No one has a doubt that the nun is a prostitute," said George, an independent MP, the history of controversial remarks about sexual assault. Why didn't she complain the first time? National Commission for Women, a statutory body that promotes women's rights, called his remarks shameful and demanded a police investigation. Next up, from the Independent, regarding the same incident, Indian nun who accused bishop of raping her 13 times says church tried to silence her. This was their response, as published on February 2019. Reading below. An Indian nun who says a bishop raped her 13 times and was urged by church officials to keep silent about it has been told the case is going to trial. Bishop Franco Molacco, who maintains his innocence, will be charged and face trial by a special prosecutor on accusations of rape and intimidation, police said. He was arrested on the 21st of September in the southern state of Kerala on suspicion of raping the nun 13 times between 2014 and 2016. She first spoke out in June, but police started formal questioning only in September as fury over the case mounted. Church acknowledged the accusations only after 5 of the women's fellow nuns mutinied and publicly rallied in her side to draw attention to her year-long quest for justice, despite what they described as heavy pressure to remain silent. We used to see the fathers of the church as equivalent to God, but not anymore, one of the nuns from the convent said. How can I tell my son about this? That the person teaching us the difference between right and wrong gave him his first communion after committing such a terrible sin. Oh yes, a sin. Really, he committed a crime. Sins are always forgivable. Crimes require facing responsibility for your actions, unlike in Christianity. Continuing on. The case is part of a larger problem in the church that Pope Francis addressed on Tuesday. For the first time after decades of silence from the Vatican, he acknowledged that sexual abuse of nuns by clerics was a continuing problem. At a time when church attendance is low in the West, the monasteries are being closed across Europe and America. The Vatican increasingly relies on places such as India to keep the faith going. If the case goes ahead, it will be a new beginning, and priests and bishops will be forced to be held accountable, said Reverend Augustine Vatuli. They should have been held accountable to begin with. So after failing in the West because of increasing education, they tried to find gullible people in third world countries to dupe in a overglorified pedophile ring, which continues to hide and rape children, waiting for the statute of limitations to expire before revealing it, and treating themselves as heroes for finally revealing them after the perpetrators have either died or the statute of limitations has been reached. This is the organization that is trying to spread the message of Jesus across the world. It's sickening. Now, for these next few ones, I want to quickly go through them in order to show just how insane it is that we, as a global community, have just normalized this. Because we don't speak out against an organization that raped children because they believe so strongly in fairy tales about Jesus Christ. All boys Catholic school run by monks acknowledges decades of sexual abuse. This was approximately 30 people abused between 1968 to 1999. All of this, our hearts are compassionate with victims after they're sued, after it's revealed, usually with limitations on what can be publicly revealed, such as right here, where the victims wasn't allowed to publicly discuss his abuse until 2014, when he won a court battle to free himself from some of the confidentiality agreement's terms. He's still not allowed to speak about the amount of a 1988 settlement he received. He's not allowed to speak about the details, not just the money that he received. Yet another victim that is nameless and faceless to all of us, really. Just a pebble on the many, many victims that this institution causes. And yet there's still this belief that they can be redeemed, forgiveness for sins, and so many other pathetic excuses for raping children. They've already committed one of the worst acts that people really argue that they would kill anyone for committing. And yet, when it's an institution that believes strongly in make-believe, everyone has the forgiveness hats on. Just read the end of this article right here. They fought me every step of the way. They attacked my family. They attacked my parents, and they attacked me. They sued my attorney for representing me, Wolf said. So the idea they've been open and honest and compassionate, that's not been my experience. I've lived a lifetime of anxiety, and far from being allowed to speak about it. I'm still not allowed to speak about some issues. This is the organization that people are defending. Because people honestly think that there's going to be a second coming. It's the most ridiculous thing. And on a deeper level, it's kind of selfish. Next up, the sex abuse of deaf orphans in Pope Francis's backyard. Now, to be clear, this is one of 67 victims. Giuseppe was born to impoverished parents outside of Verona in northern Italy, with a congenital birth defect that left him deaf and mute. This is from The Sex Abuse of Deaf Orphans in Pope Francis's Backyard, article by The Daily Beast, published on October 18th. When it became clear that his parents could not provide for him, much less communicate with him, they brought him to the local Catholic church, which enrolled him in their Antonio Provallo Institute for Deaf and Mute Children. It was here that he learned to communicate through standard sign language and their visual cues. It was also where he became one of scores of victims of the priests and religious brothers who ran the school. When he was 11, a monk who worked at the institute was an educator. As an educator, started teaching special secret signs for things like masturbation, fellatio, penis, and anus. Quote, I didn't understand at first just why this man was teaching me these strange secret signs, Giuseppe explained in an exclusive and very emotional interview in Rome. Then one day it became very clear when one of the priests made the secret sign for fellatio and we were alone, which was followed by him pushing his erect penis into my mouth. From that point on, Giuseppe said through his interpreter, often using fast and somewhat violent sign language, as tears ran down his face. Priests and the brothers would give a sign to the young boys and then take them to special rooms, Giuseppe says, were used for timeout punishments or as resting areas, except that because everyone was deaf at the school except those who worked there, no one could hear the screams and cries of young boys when the abuse took place. Giuseppe said that on several occasions he and others tried to write down what was happening, but because their letters and notes were given to the priests and brothers to be mailed out, they were likely intercepted. Of course we screamed and cried, he said. Sometimes you would see priests coming into the dormitory at night, or you would see friends with tears rolling down their faces, and you knew exactly what had just happened. You didn't need to hear to know. The abuse against Giuseppe allegedly lasted for 7 full years until he turned 18 and left the institution. Whenever he tried to explain what was happening to him inside the school, no one understood because the language he had been taught to describe the sexual acts was incomprehensible to sign language readers. It was so frustrating that no one understood what we said, Giuseppe explained, adding that even after he left the institution and lived in another Catholic charity house, he had a difficult time making anyone understand what had happened. It took a long time for us to be believed. Giuseppe is one of 67 young boys who have been named in court documents and were allegedly abused by more than 24 priests and brothers at the Provallo Institute, according to Verona prosecutors who have been investigating the allegations for nearly a decade and who plan to bring it to trial later this year. One of the most notorious alleged offenders was Father Nicola Corradi, now 83, who was moved to South America in the mid-1980s after Giuseppe and others' abuse claims came to light, rather than handing him over to secular authorities or asking the Mother Church in Rome to defrock him. The bishop transferred him to the Provallo Institute in Mendoza, Argentina. Several other priests accused of abuse in Verona were also transferred to the sister school in Argentina. have since passed away. In Argentina, court documents there would later allege that Corradi In Argentina, court documents there would later allege that Corradi was soon up to his usual practices, and despite credible reports from Italy that were beginning to surface, he was allowed to stay in his job at the school for the deaf, where he apparently found like-minded abusers. He was finally arrested in 2016 on allegations that he abused 22 deaf and mute children over the course of nearly 3 decades. 3 other priests were arrested with him. There are more than 60 civil trials going on across Argentina against the priests like Corradi, who allegedly abused children. Giulietta Anazco was one of those victims at the Provolo Institute. She says she was first abused by Father Ricardo Jimenez, who worked at the institute. He first attacked her when she was just 7 years old, she says, when the two were in a tent being used as a confessional at a Catholic youth festival. The abuse went on for 3 years before her parents found out and filed a complaint. Jimenez was then transferred by the Archdiocese of Buenos Aires under the direction of then Cardinal George Mario Bergoglio, now Pope Francis. Anazco is now a pivotal member of Argentina's branch of the Survivors Network of those abused by priests, known as SNAP. She told the German magazine Der Spiegel in a cover story out last week that she and another group of students from the Provolo Institute tried to meet on several occasions with Bergoglio before he was elected as Pope, because he was the highest-ranking prelate in the diocese at the time. Then in July 2013, she and 13 other victims wrote a letter to the new pontiff to remind him about what happened in his native country under his watch. Jimenez, who professes his innocence, is still an active priest, although he was arrested and briefly detained. That letter was never answered by Francis, but Anazco did receive proof of receipt. She is lobbying a court in Argentina to open a civil suit against the Pope for overlooking complaints when he was the head of the Archdiocese. Watchdog website Bishop Accountability outlines 5 cases that Pope Francis overlooked as cardinal. One concerns Father Cesar Grassi. Earlier this year, the Associated Press uncovered a secret 2,000-page forensic study commissioned by Bergoglio in 2010 to study whether Grassi, a priest who worked at the Provolo Institute and founded a home for street children he is alleged to have abused, and who already had been convicted in secular courts and sentenced to 15 years in prison, was truly guilty. The report concluded that he was not, and that the case did not merit a criminal trial. The report is by the Catholic Church, by the way. Also, to be clear, this crime, rape of deaf and mute children, is not the same as the cover-up of U.S. priests raping 200 deaf boys, which was revealed in 2010. These are not the same event. The one that I just read now was a different crime than the 200 deaf boys who were raped in the United States, which was revealed when Pope Ratzinger was in power. That particular case centered around Reverend Lawrence C. Murphy, who raped children in Wisconsin between 1950 to 1974. Just to clarify. Because I've noticed people confuse the two, and there's this belief that people are trying to reopen the same old case as a way of hurting the Catholic Church's image, but no, these are two different cases of raped deaf children. In the US, it was around 200 victims, and in Argentina and Italy, it was a different amount. Italy was 67. The portion on Argentina didn't reveal how many were victimized. Okay, so next up, a BuzzFeed article titled, "We Saw Nuns Kill Children. The Ghosts of St. Joseph's Catholic Orphanage." Now, BuzzFeed has made a video on this. You can read this full, detailed article whenever you please. I won't do it here because there's so much information. Quite honestly, there's so much detail regarding this. And I think one of the finer points that I found truly fascinating is that lawyers, judges, and so forth, they try to argue that victims don't want to re-experience the trauma that they faced in the court cases. They're not ready to talk about it. And so they're sometimes not even asked if they want to go forward with the cases, because the assumption is that they won't. When in reality, a lot of these victims, especially when they were children, victims, stretching as far back as when they were children, really do want to go forward, want to seek justice for what was done to them. So it seems that society has built this fear of trigger warnings and phobias of what you shouldn't say to victims, when in reality these trigger warnings and supposed phobias are just re-victimizing these people and robbing them of the opportunity to get justice for what was done to them. I think, in all honesty, that was the most interesting aspect and interesting and educational aspect of this piece, because the rest is really just a horror show. And it is sad that people still try to justify the Catholic Church. Even the victims of the Catholic Church try to justify it by saying that, it's just a few bad eggs, they just need to get out, and then the Catholic Church will be back to normal. But in reality, considering the fact that this has been going on for decades, in the case of the Native Americans since the 1870s, and if you go further back than that, what was all the imperialism, torture, and rape? Well, that was not abnormal for the Catholic Church. So why should we not consider the teachings themselves to be a natural cause and effect for the abuses that happen? Because historically, They may not have been the abnormal behavior of Catholic teachings, but rather the norm because of those teachings. It's just something you should think about. And if this still bothers people, I'd like to quickly run down the Catholic Church's responses to child rapists in their organization, just so you know the trajectory of what happened, or at least have a better grasp of it. So, moving right along. In February 2017, the Pope quietly trimmed sanctions for child rapists seeking mercy. This did not get much of a headline. The news organizations didn't really spread it around and publicize it. Reads right on the front line. Pope Francis has quietly reduced sanctions against a handful of pedophile priests, applying his vision of a merciful church even to its worst offenders in ways that survivors of abuse and the Pope's own advisors question. One case has come back to haunt him. An Italian priest who received the Pope's clemency was later convicted by an Italian criminal court for his sex crimes against children, his rape of children as young as 12. The Reverend Mauro Inzoli is now facing a second church trial after new evidence emerged against him, the Associated Press learned. Now, I'm sure many of you will try to argue that his heart's in the right place. Mercy is a definite good, shows compassion and love, even for the worst. But I think this is just, these values, these Christian values, enable crime. Enable it. It doesn't dissuade from it. It doesn't, like, this whole idea that, oh, they're forced to acknowledge what they've done to God, and they receive penance for coming to terms and seeking repentance and so forth. Repentance is really just a humble brag. It's a way of speaking openly about the crimes you've committed, including the rape of children, and bragging about it. And getting away with it because of the seal of confession. For those who don't know how potent the seal of confession is, very next article. From the BBC News, August 2017. Now this is several months after February. Same year, though. Australia church abuse. Why priests can't spill confession. Now, to give my point further credibility, in this article, it says as follows. Surely priests have a moral duty, if not a legal one, to report any concerns in order to protect children. Archbishop Mark Coleridge of Brisbane appeared to recognize that it can be hard for non-Catholics to understand why this is not the case. The answer lies in the special status of confession in the Roman Catholic Church. Officially known as the Sacrament of Penance, it is the seven sacraments of the Church. The penitent person wishing to confess talks to the priest or bishop, beginning with the words, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." The Catholics believe that within the confessional, the penitent is talking to God, the priest serving as the intermediary. The priest is able to absolve the person of their sins. But crucially, everything which takes place within the confession is secret. This is known as the seal of the confession. What happens if the priest breaks the seal? Under the law of the church, if a priest breaks the seal, he is automatically punished with excommunication. That is, being expelled from the church. That is the ultimate sanction for a priest, and in this case can only be reversed by the Pope himself. Confessors are not even allowed to reveal whether someone has been to confession, let alone what they said. This is a easy way to commit crimes, brag about it to someone, and go on doing the same thing, constantly gaining forgiveness from the church, whose very institution relies on allowing such horrific behavior to continue. And by the way, the fact that all humans are sinful and have a tendency to fall into sin helps to justify this sort of maladaptive behavior. And furthermore, just so this point is made across, that the defense for this is the institution, protecting the institution of the church. So the institution itself is used as a basis to defend this sort of criminal behavior. Repentance, the definition of repentance, the original definition, just means to recognize Jesus as your Lord and Savior. It does not mean that you apologize to the victims of the crime. The victims of the crime don't even matter. All that matters is prostrating yourself to Jesus, accepting His love and mercy. This is the design of venerating a narcissist, Jesus Christ, the narcissistic figure of the church, endlessly praising Him and loving Him more than your own family, giving Him everything you have, just so that you can get away with whatever you want. Consider what Jesus actually taught. He's God, He's also the Son of God. If you don't believe it, you're going to hell. So you have to endlessly venerate a narcissist's belief that he's God and the Son of God. And if you don't believe that, he'll send you to hell. And He will forgive you for whatever crimes you commit, so long as you keep recognizing Him as God. He will keep forgiving you for whatever horrible crimes, rape, murder, theft, whatever horrible crimes you commit, so long as you recognize Him for His godhood. Christianity is just the ravings of a narcissist with a literal God complex. That is why you have all this horrific behavior by priests. They believe this more literally than others. It's not good moral behavior. It's endlessly venerating a narcissist, trying to emulate this narcissist, and then going on with power trips because you are behaving like Jesus. A man who thought himself a god. Nothing about Christianity is moral. Nothing. It would be more appropriate to say that people are better than Jesus. Christians, on average, are better people than Jesus Christ Himself was. Moving along. Just in case you do not believe that what I'm saying is true, the headline of this August 31st, 2018 article: Australian Catholic Church rejects calls for priests to report child abuse confessions. This is real. This is the real ramifications. victims of child rape matter less than the fairy tale of venerating a narcissist as a god. Next event. When it came now, Vatican orders U.S. bishops to delay taking action on a sexual abuse crisis. This was in November 13th, 2018. After the Australian Catholic Church argued that priests shouldn't go reporting child rape crimes to the police, Vatican orders U.S. bishops to delay taking action on sexual abuse crisis. There was supposed to be a vote on this where people were opening up for reforms, actual reforms on how U.S. bishops should process child rape abuses. And I'll read the excerpt as follows. Okay, in Baltimore. The Vatican has told the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to delay voting on measures to hold bishops accountable for failing to protect children from sexual abuse. The president of the conference said in a surprise announcement Monday morning. In announcing the decision to his fellow bishops, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo said he was disappointed by the Vatican's interference, which he said he learned of on Sunday afternoon. Quote, at the insistence of the Holy See, we will not be voting on the two action items in our docket regarding the abuse crisis, said DiNardo. For weeks, the U.S. Catholic bishops have trumpeted a series of reforms they had hoped to make after what one cardinal called the Church's summer of hell. Those reforms must be approved by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which gathers the country's bishops twice a year to debate and adopt new policies. Vatican's 11th hour intervention, ordered by its congregation of 4 bishops, according to DiNardo, essentially puts the American bishops' reforms on hold. DiNardo, who looked shell-shocked Monday morning, tried to put a positive spin on the Vatican's decision, calling it a bump in the road. A euphemism for failing to make reforms on an ever-present array of crimes regarding child rape. I just... what the fuck? Why? Why do people believe in this institution? But many bishops gathered in Baltimore through Wednesday were surprised and unhappy about the Vatican's decision, acknowledged Bishop Christopher Coyne of Vermont said the bishops had been thrown a little sideways by Monday's announcement. We are not ourselves happy about this, DiNardo said during a press conference Monday in Baltimore. We have been working hard to get to the action stage, and we'll do it. We have to get past this bump in the road. Yet we'll do it, but this top-down dictatorial control system that they have on this religious organization prevents them from making reforms regarding child rape in their institution. You might think DiNardo and his fellows are good people. Perhaps they are. But you can see how this organization does everything in its power to prevent to prevent helping victims. It cares about its institution more than it does the victims of its institutions. Moving along. DiNardo also said that the text of the proposals for the bishops' meeting this week were finalized in October 30th, which did not leave much time for the Vatican to raise objections or advise modifications. So they just put a stop to it. Now, here's what Francis did. Sorry, you know what? Not even Francis. Not just Francis. Here's what the Catholic Church as a whole. It is not just one person. It is not just one person who is responsible for this, who has control over this. This entire organization is completely at fault. We shouldn't look for one person whose face is on the cover of news articles as the reason why. The reason why is because of how this institution functions. The reason why is because of what this institution believes in, the teachings of Jesus. So, moving right along. Pope Francis tells clerics who abuse minors to hand themselves in. This was on December 21st, 2018. Now keep in mind, he had shut down the Catholic Church as a whole. Now keep in mind this important fact. Catholic Church as a whole had shut down attempts at reform in Australia, in the US, perhaps elsewhere too. And then said the clerics who abuse minors should just turn themselves in when it came to adopting actual reforms that could hold them responsible, hold their institution responsible. They didn't do it. And they rejected calls to do that, specifically because of their religious beliefs, because of their faith in Jesus Christ. That is why they didn't do it. Next up. When it came time for the reconciliation meeting, a few months later, top Catholic cardinal admits church destroyed documents on clergy's sexual abuse. And you could recall from the earlier articles where some of these records were tampered with or otherwise destroyed, such as lighting a bonfire on some of them. Moving to the article to read the whole thing. In a remarkable admission, German Cardinal Reinhard Marx said Saturday that documents that could have contained proof of clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church were destroyed or never drawn up. This is why it's important to recognize, it's not just one person, it's not just the head of the organization, the Pope, who's just the face of it. This entire organization is unforgivable. Continuing on, this quote, files that could have documented the terrible deeds and named those responsible were destroyed or not even created, said Marx, the Archbishop of Munich and president of the German Bishops' Conference. Quote, the stipulated procedures and processes for the prosecution offenses were deliberately not complied with, he added, but instead cancelled and overridden. Such standard practices will make it clear that it is not transparency which damages the Church, rather the acts of abuse committed, the lack of transparency, or the ensuing cover-up. Marx's stunning admission came on the third day of the historic Vatican summit focused on combating clergy sexual abuse. The day's theme was transparency, which Marx said could help to tackle abuse of power. A member of Pope Francis's A member of Pope Francis' inner circle of advisors, Marx is one of the most powerful men in the Catholic Church. A 4-day summit of 190 Catholic leaders, including 114 bishops from around the world, will conclude Sunday with an address by Pope Francis. Thursday, at the beginning of the unprecedented summit, Francis urged the bishops to take concrete measures to combat the clergy sexual abuse. The clergy abuse scandal. They don't, still the euphemisms. They don't just call it Catholic Church raping children. Catholic Church child rape abuse scandals, which is what it should be called. Continuing on. At a press conference later Saturday, Marx said that the information about destroying files came from a study commissioned by German bishops in 2014. The study was scientific and did not name the particular church leaders or dioceses in Germany that destroyed the files. Did not name them. Quote, the study indicates that some documents were manipulated or did not contain what they should have contained, Marx said. The fact in itself cannot be denied. Marx said he doubts the destruction of files related to clergy sexual abuse was limited to one diocese. I assume Germany is not an isolated case. A report commissioned by the German bishops also revealed that at least 3,677 cases of child sex abuse, child rape, by German clergy occurred between 1946 and 2014. Moving right along. And just to keep in mind what this means, the Catholic Church has paid nearly $4 billion over sexual abuse claims, group says. A nonprofit group that tracks allegations of abuse within the Catholic Church said Saturday that the Church has paid out nearly $4 billion in lawsuits over allegations of clerical sexual abuse, leading back to the 1980s. Bishop Accountability, whose mission is documenting the abuse crisis in the Roman Catholic Church, according to their website, says that there are also payouts involving over 8,600 cases of assault survivors abused by a member of the clergy dating back to the 1950s. Just to clarify, this is from Newsweek. This article is from August 2018. Just to give you more knowledge on just how much money is spent using lawyers to fight against the victims that they create. The victims that this organization, the Catholic Church, creates. The largest known payout amounted to over $600 million in 2007. CNN reported on Saturday, issued on behalf of 221 priests and their other church employees accused of abusing and victimizing over 500 people. Imagine what this sort of scale of damage is like in third world countries where they're less able to protect themselves than they're already unable to protect themselves in Western countries. This has to be stopped. The reason it's not stopped is because of this reverential belief in fairy tales, because of this idea that all religions must be respected. All fairy tales must be respected equally. Even when they do the most egregious crimes like this and spend billions. How many people have donated to this church only for them to spend these billions on defending its own institution by funding court cases against the victims that they created? Just let that sink in. Next. And just so you think that it doesn't get worse, NBC News on June 4th, 2019. The Catholic Church spent $10 million on lobbyists in fight to stymie priest sex abuse suits. I'll just read the whole thing. The U.S. Catholic Church spent $10.6 million on lobbyists to prevent victims of clerical sex abuse from suing for damages. Yeah, remember those people trying to reform and put in place reforms? Instead, they're doing this now. Yeah. According to a new report, the money was doled out from 2011 through 2018 in 8 northeastern states, where bills to reform statute of limitations laws were either in the works or being considered. This is what the Catholic Church is spending their donations on. This is what the Catholic Church is spending their donation money on. This year, not even like a few years ago, this year, this report lays out what we have known all along, that the Catholic Church refuses to take responsibility for the decades of abuse that took place knowingly under its watch, said attorney Stephen Weiss, who works for one of the law firms that commissioned the study. Statute of limitations reforms give survivors more time to obtain some measure of closure on the atrocities committed against them, said attorney Gerald Williams added. Attorney Gerald Williams added. The Church has yet to implement meaningful reforms by working to prevent these laws from passing. The Church is clearly demonstrating that it does not stand with survivors. In Pennsylvania, where currently victims of child sex abuse can come forward with criminal allegations until the age of 50 and can file civil claims until age 30, the Church spent $5,322,979 to keep those limitations in place, according to the report. According to the report, Church influencing state, how the Catholic Church spent millions against survivors of clergy abuse. The report was commissioned by Seeger Weiss LLP, Williams Sider LLC, Abraham Watkins, and the Simpson Tugel law firm, which collectively represent 300 survivors of clergy sex abuse nationwide. The data in the report was obtained from public filings in the individual states. Attorney General Josh Shapiro, whose blockbuster grand jury report last year identified 301 predator priests in 6 dioceses who were alleged to have abused more than 1,000 children, has been leading the charge to lift those statutes of limitations. The extensive lobbying by the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania against the reforms recommended by the grand jury proves what I have said all along. The Church cannot be trusted to police itself, Shapiro said. It's reprehensible that the Church continues to spend significant sums of money fighting these reforms instead of protecting and supporting the victims of clergy sexual abuse. Pennsylvania Catholic Conference and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops did not return an NBC News request for comment. In New York, the Church spent $2,912,772 in what ultimately was a failed bid to prevent the passage of the Child Victims Act, which Governor Andrew Cuomo signed into law on February 14th. It allows child sexual abuse victims to sue their abuser or institutions until age 55. Previously, the cutoff was age 23. Of that money, 80% went to the Catholic Conference Policy Group Incorporated, which was tasked with lobbying a statute of limitations, legislative issues, and liability issues, the report found. I think it's incredibly troubling that parishioners who on Sundays contribute to the church collections may have been inadvertently funding lobbying efforts against victims of sex abuse seeking legal redress. New York State Senator Brad Holyman, who championed the Child Victims Act, said $3 million that went for lobbying could have done a lot of good elsewhere, including soup kitchens, after-school programs for children, support for seniors. In my district, a Catholic school that is closing might perhaps have stayed open if that money had been used for better causes. Shortly before the New York State legislature took up the Child Victims Act, Cardinal Timothy Dolan called in an op-ed published in the New York Daily News for measures that would avoid breaking the Roman Catholic Church. In an email to NBC News, Dennis Paust, a spokesman for the New York State Catholic Conference, said, "All of our lobbying activity is reported as required by law to the Joint Commission for Public Ethics and has always been publicly available." Quote, "As far as the Child Victims Act, while we did raise concerns about the one-year look back, ultimately when sponsors amended the bill at our request to provide an opportunity for recourse to survivors in public institutions, the Catholic Church dropped its opposition this year," he wrote. After spending nearly $3 million actually, to stop that bill from becoming law. Continuing on. When asked for comment, New York Diocese spokesman Joseph Zwelling referred NBC News to Paust. In Connecticut, where advocates for victims of priest sex abuse are presently pushing for the elimination of statute of limitations for major sex crimes, the church spent $875,261, according to the report. The report also said the church spent $633,458 in New Jersey, where Governor Phil Murphy last month signed legislation that allows child victims to sue up until they turn 55 or within 7 years of their first realization that the abuse caused them harm, according to the Associated Press. During the time period, the church spent $5,370,551 in Massachusetts, $1,204,260 in Maine, and $61,961 in Rhode Island. "That is completely inaccurate," said James Driscoll, executive director of the Massachusetts Catholic Conference. "I have no idea where the writer of this report came up with this figure. They never checked with me for any input before they wrote this report." And in New Hampshire, where legislation to lift or amend the statute of limitations has yet to be introduced, the church has spent $134,345, according to the report. Tom Bebbington, spokesman for the Diocese of Manchester, said it advocates for the state legislature on issues of importance for the good of all citizens, including abortion, assisted suicide, education, preventing human trafficking, and repeal of the death penalty. The services of lobbying professionals were used during the time period of this report for advocacy on all of these issues and more. But no lobbyist was engaged to advocate on behalf of the diocese on statute of limitations legislation, he insisted. David Clusie, the former director of the Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests, or SNAP, said church funds should never be used to fight clerical abuse victims. Quote, "It's appalling the parishioners' donations are used to keep child sex crimes and those who committed and concealed them covered up," said Clusie. "There's no better indication of how bishops think and act than where they put their flock's funds, and there are few more egregious and reckless ways to spend churchgoers' contributions than to put their kids at risk by fighting secular reforms that help expose predators. Asked if he believes the church is willing to spend that kind of money on lobbyists because it feared payouts for victims who would cost 10 times more, Weiss said that appears to be the case. Quote, Church made the solus decision to spend $10 million of its dollars to evade its responsibility to those harmed by clergy abuse, rather that use those funds towards the healing process, he said. Clearly, these expenditures were aimed at protecting the church's financial interests, not at doing the right thing. Now, given all this, given the overwhelming brutality what this horrible institution has done, what is the point of believing in all these ridiculous fantasies, like loving people you hate, or forgiving people no matter what, and to treat that as some form of compassion? Forgiving people means not holding them responsible for their actions. There should be no more forgiveness left. People need to hold this institution accountable for their actions. Because right now, quite honestly, the Catholic Church, a lot of its conservative members are now trying to blame Jewish people and Jewish conspiracies. It's so absurd and disgusting. They're trying to blame Jewish people for the problems within the Catholic Church. And I don't mean like just in the West, but also in places in the third world where they're trying to spread this ideology. It's easier to understand why this is happening when you understand what Christianity as an institution really is. The teachings of Jesus are teachings of hate. Not compassion, not any real love, because you don't just love people who treat you horribly and people who treat you well equally. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any rational sense. These preachings were the ravings of a deluded narcissist from the first century. And just because other people like Muhammad from Islam are worse does not make Christianity better. Just because there are one or two, or maybe even a normal problem within other religions does not make this problem somehow better. That would fall into, all of that would still fall into make-believe. That is, fairy tales, creating problems for humanity. Catholicism is a horrible, dangerous, violent ideology that is still respected even now. It has committed some of the worst crimes and is a pedophile ring. does not deserve your respect. It does not deserve your compassion. It doesn't deserve your forgiveness. The teachings of Jesus are the teachings of hate. And hate is toxic. It ruins lives. It destroys people. And it must be soundly rejected. The only way to end these horrible rape crimes is to reject the Catholic Church. To reject its fairy tales, which are causing child rape. You have to understand that this cannot be the standard that people live with. Please just think about everything I've said. If this was any other institution, it would have been shut down. But because it's a faith-based institution, people want it reformed because they were indoctrinated into the make-believe, the fairy tales, and believed in them more strongly than reality. This sort of abhorrent behavior must be soundly rejected. For the good of human rights, and for genuine compassion for the victims of Catholicism.